Everyone laughed at Emily, the young waitress who worked quietly in a small diner, her face always flushed with nervousness as she tried to balance trays and take orders with a shaky smile. At only 22, she carried burdens far heavier than most her age. After the sudden death of her parents in a tragic accident, she became the sole caretaker of her younger brother, working long hours to keep food on the table and pay the rent. Most nights she managed to hide her exhaustion, but this evening was different. Her trembling hands betrayed her as she spilled drinks on a customer's jacket, and the corner table erupted in cruel laughter that echoed across the diner like a spotlight on her humiliation. "Maybe you should find another job," one of them sneered, while another whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She can't even do the simplest things right." Emily's heart pounded as her eyes stung with tears. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. She needed every tip to survive. She bent down to clean the mess, trying to ignore the mocking voices, when the diner door opened and a man stepped inside. His name was Daniel Hayes, though no one recognized him. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who had once known the sting of poverty and ridicule, and now carried himself with quiet authority. He chose a booth near the window, watching the scene unfold. When Emily nervously approached his table, avoiding his eyes, he ordered a coffee and then, in a voice so gentle it startled her, added, "You're doing just fine." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her all day, and though she tried to smile, she hurried away with tears threatening to fall. Minutes later, the cruel group struck again. One man stuck his foot out as Emily passed, making her stumble, the tray crashing to the floor in a shower of broken glass. The diner roared with laughter, the sound cutting deeper than any blade, until a voice rang out above them all, "Enough." The laughter stopped instantly. Daniel stood, his presence commanding, his eyes fixed on the bullies. "I've been watching," he said firmly. "Do you really think humiliating someone who's working hard makes you better than them? From where I'm standing, it only makes you small." The group shifted uncomfortably, muttering that it was just a joke, but Daniel's voice grew sharper. "Breaking someone's spirit is not a joke. Respect costs nothing, but the lack of it reveals everything about who you are." The diner went silent, even the cook frozen behind the counter, as Daniel knelt beside Emily, who was still on the floor trying to gather the glass. A millionaire, dressed in a sharp suit, lowered himself to help a waitress no one else respected. He looked at her with kindness and said softly, "Don't ever let their words define you. You're stronger than they'll ever know." Emily's voice trembled as she whispered, "Why would you defend me?" And Daniel smiled sadly. "Because I know what it's like to be laughed at. I was mocked, doubted, told I'd never succeed. And now I run one of the biggest companies in the state. But none of that matters more than remembering where I came from. People like you remind me of the fight it takes to keep going." He handed her his business card, finished his coffee, and before leaving, placed a tip on the table, so generous it covered not only her night's wages, but nearly a month's rent. With one last look, he said, "Keep going, Emily. The world needs people with your strength." And then he walked out, leaving behind silence so heavy the cruel group slipped away without another word. Emily stood taller that night, clutching the card in her hand, her heart filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She realized that her worth had never been tied to the laughter of strangers, but to her resilience, her kindness, and the strength she carried through every struggle. And from that night on, she remembered one lesson that would guide her forever. Never let cruelty convince you that you are less, because sometimes all it takes is one voice of courage to remind you that you matter.